Young warriors, we will be making the ultimate sacrifice, following the gods into the San Fernando Valley to talk about a time before the Ultimate Warrior, before there was Sting, when it was Jim Hellwig and Steve Borden, and how they became the Bladerunners. Daze with Jordan the Lion. It begins right now.
So Terry Straw, today's special Patreon sunglass vlog is for you, and yes, these are sunglasses. You might have got the coolest pair ever. So if you grew up in the 80s and you're a wrestling fan, you know who the Ultimate Warrior and you know who Sting are. But for today's vlog, you need to know who they were before. Jim Hellwig was the original name of the Warrior, and Steve Borden was the original name of the man who would be Sting. Now, Jim was raised in Indiana. His father, he said, was long gone early on in his life, so he was raised by his mother. She was a hard worker, worked, you know, very, very hard because of his siblings, making sure that they weren't on welfare and everything. And Jim would say that his mother, maybe one of the only downsides to his mother, is that she believed whatever lot in life that you were born into was just how you stayed. And if you were born into a struggling family, that you would just always be someone who struggled. And he said that his life really changed when he was in his junior year in high school in Indiana, and he walked into the equipment room where you could work out in his high school. He said they had a little circuit training machine, and he said this was kind of in the days where they didn't really believe that athletes should lift weights because it screwed up your natural performance style. But he said it was kind of starting to change at that time, and he was just a skinny runt of a kid, so he walked in there and he said he started going more and more because he was gaining more and more confidence. And he said, I would see my body starting to grow. And he said that was like really the first realization in his life that seeing his body grow let him know, oh, I actually have control of a lot of things. Like, I can control my destiny and things. And so he said he kind of set his sights on wanting to go to college. He'd never really thought of it before, but he said he went to his guidance counselor, and where he went to school, he said everybody was either a farmer or a factory worker. And when he went in there, he said, I want to go to college. He said my guidance counselor looked at me and said, what you need to do is you need to, this summer, go get a job at the factory, and then when you come back to school, you'll already have your foot in the door, and when you graduate, they'll give you a full-time job. And that's that. And he said they really didn't listen to him. And so he said he knew then that he had something inside him that told him he should do more, and that he could not let the people that were going to stifle him have any control over him. So he said he did, in fact, end up going to Indiana State University and continued building his body, and actually he said at the time, a guy who was there teaching, Professor Jones, who really inspired him and helped him build his body even bigger. And Jim started coming up with the idea that maybe he would be a competition bodybuilder. But after he won the Mr. Georgia title in 1984, he would make a trip out to Los Angeles that eventually would change his entire career path. Hope you guys enjoyed today's vlog. Let's hop in the car. We're gonna head over to where the Ultimate Warrior and Sting first met. And as for the Stinger, Steve Borden, he was raised out here in Los Angeles, a little outside section called Santa Clarita, and he also would eventually become inspired to become a bodybuilder. All right, we're heading to the valley, specifically Reseda. It's a real town, not just a fictitious town from Karate Kid. So this is one of the vlogs I've always wanted to do, and the thing that always stopped me was I could never figure out where the gym was. I would always see that Steve Borden, would mention that he had a Gold's Gym in the valley, but I didn't realize until yesterday when I found this info. I found a group that posted a picture of this gym in 1986 and said, at the time, the only gym in the valley. So that's how I was able to figure out that we were in the right place. It's not a Gold's Gym anymore, but let me tell you what happened here. It's now called Small Car Parts and Accessories for Volkswagens and Porsches. This was the Gold's Gym of the Valley. in 1985, Steve Borden, who we would futurely known as Sting, the Stinger, owned this gym, will co-own this gym with a man named Ed Connors, who was the treasurer of the Venice Beach Gold's Gym. Now in 1985, in addition to co-owning this Gold's Gym, Steve Borden was training to be a competition bodybuilder, which was very popular at the time, so he was pretty big in his own right. And he had lost out to advancing the Mr. Los Angeles by like 1 or 2 points. And he said at the time, his partner Ed Connors called him and said, hey, I got a guy coming. He just won the Mr. Georgia competition. His name's Jim Hellwig. Can you set him up with some workout time and let him tan in our gym? And so that's originally how Steve Borden and Jim Hellwig, who would eventually become professionally known as Sting and the Ultimate Warrior, would originally meet. Now Sting said at the time, Jim Hellwig was freakishly big. Even for the guys that were coming and working out here, Jim was pretty big. And he said he was 285 pounds. At the time, Steve Borden Sting was 260. And he said that Jim was so big, he actually broke the glass in the tanning beds here. So he had stayed and trained and tanned here for about a week. And then about a year later, Steve Borden at this same gym said a man came in and asked if he could, his name was Rick Bassman, he said he asked if he could post an ad looking for a 4th bodybuilder to train as a wrestler. He was putting together something called Power Team USA, and he had 3 guys, but he needed a 4th. So Steve said, yeah, absolutely, you can put your ad up here. And he said it was up for a few weeks and nobody showed any interest. And Rick had actually secured an investor who was gonna pay $2,500 per wrestler to train. He was gonna pay for their training. So he said after a few weeks when nobody showed interest, Rick said, what about you, Steve? And Steve's like, well, I didn't grow up watching wrestling. He grew up here in Santa Clarita and said that wrestling wasn't televised, and so he just wasn't into it. And in fact, he said one time he was working out and Hulk Hogan was in there and someone pointed him out and he had no clue who he was. He said they finally had to say, he's in the Rocky movies. And he's like, oh, okay, I know who he is. So he said after the few weeks that ad had been posted, nobody showed interest, and he asked Steve. Steve said, you know, I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, well, if this guy's willing to dump 10 grand into training guys, I should probably take up the opportunity. So he signed up and started training with the other 3 men in the camp. And he said one day, one of the guys in the Power Team USA didn't show back up again. And they needed a 4th guy and asked Steve if he knew anybody. And he said, I remembered a year before meeting Jim, and that Jim was super big and we needed a super big guy. So I called Jim on the phone and said, hey, would you like to come and join this and train with us? It's all paid and everything. And he said, Jim said, oh, I've been wanting to get into wrestling. I've tried it before, it just didn't work out. Yeah, I want to come. And he said he immediately made his way out here, attended the last 4 weeks of the training camp, and then he said they sent out, well, they took photos. They took publicity photos of all 4 guys in the Power Team USA, and then Jim got the idea to mail them out to the different wrestling territories. And he said within 3 days of them mailing them out, literally like the day it got into Jerry Jarrett's hands in Nashville, he called and got a hold of Steve Borden, and Jim Hellwig was living with him at the time, ran in, grabbed the other phone, they're both listening, and Steve said, he says, you know, I like the photo, but I can only use 2 of you. And Steve said, which 2? And he said, I want the 2 on the left. And that was Steve Borden and Jim Hellwig. So that's how they ended up getting their first job with Jerry Jarrett, and they immediately got into a car and took off for Nashville. Steve said at the time Jim was in chiropractic school in Atlanta and had given that up, and Steve wasn't able to manage here because he was going to be leaving, so they didn't really have much of an income other than what they were going to get wrestling. So they started driving across country, and he said he'll never forget how excited Jim was as they made their way east to stop at a Waffle House. He kept talking about it, and Steve Borden Sting said eventually we found one outside of New Mexico and we had to stop. And he goes, Jim got like 4 pecan waffles, 4 eggs over easy on top of it with syrup, a ham and cheese omelet. He said he had like all kinds of stuff scattered, covered and smothered. He said it was a big deal to Jim to get to have that meal, but he said that was the last time they really had a good meal, because after that it was pretty much tuna in a can for many, many months while they tried to make it in wrestling. So originally when they got to Jerry Jarrett's, Jerry decided to make them baby faces, which is, if you don't follow wrestling, those are like the good guys. So he called them the Freedom Fighters, gave them tights with stars all over it, and they were so green, as in inexperienced wrestlers, that they were what you call stiff. When they were doing the moves, they were hurting people. They were hitting them harder than you should. They didn't know the craft yet. And eventually Jerry just said, you know, look, you guys are hurting people, so I'm gonna switch you, and made them a tag team called the Bladerunners that would be based off of the Road Warriors, because those guys were so successful. The difference was, Steve would say that, you know, the Road Warriors were told to injure people and to do that. We weren't. We were just inexperienced, and eventually Jerry said, hey, I can't have you guys working here anymore, but I'm not gonna just be done with you. I'm gonna send you off to Bill Watts. And so they went off to Bill Watts' promotion and continued wrestling there. Hard to believe this used to be the only Gold's Gym in this area, where everyone that had an ambition to be a bodybuilder would train for the most part. Now, Steve said the goal was always to be a tag team for life. I mean, in his mind, that's what it was. It was, we were gonna be the next Road Warriors, but in our own way and bigger. We never had any intention of splitting up, becoming the Ultimate Warrior or Sting. And he said, once we moved on to Bill Watts, he said they worked us a lot. We were traveling a lot and we had no money. Jim had a wife and I had my own place. He said we were having trouble coming up with rent. We just didn't make enough to where you could eat, pay for the gas to do the gigs, and to pay rent. And he said finally we were working so much, but he said when we started with Bill Watts, he withheld 2 of your checks for some reason, and then would pay you the third check and would eventually pay you the first 2 way later on down the line. And he said we had worked a lot. We had done like 9 shows a week, so in a 2-week pay period we had done 18 performances. And he said whether it be run-ins or main event matches or whatever, he said, so we were expecting a big check, and when we got paid, we showed up for a match in Mississippi and we got paid $450 a piece, and we were like, we cannot afford to do this anymore. We can't afford this. So they're actually dressed with their makeup on. It's funny, they wore makeup, but he said when it started, it was actually based off of like Rocky Horror Picture Show, and then it just got bigger and bigger because Jim as a person was someone who liked to go big, as you would later see in his Ultimate Warrior character. But he said we were dressed and ready to fight, and we got the money, and we just said no way. So we bailed, and they called us and said, hey, you guys have to come back. You're gonna burn a bridge in this business. We don't even want Jim back, but we want you to come back to Arkansas for tomorrow night. We're withholding 2 of your checks and 2 of Jim's. Jim's not gonna get his checks, but if you want yours, you better come. And Steve said, I was immediately thinking they were gonna jump me or something like that. And he said, so I called Jim, and I kept calling, couldn't get a hold of him, went to all the gyms that he worked out. I could not find the guy to tell him what they wanted us to do. And he said, finally it came time to where I had to take off and drive to the match. He said, I drove, went and did the gig. They didn't jump me. He said, I got some of the money, and finally when I was in my hotel, I called, got a hold of Jim, and he's like, what are you doing, man? Where are you? And I'm like, I explained the whole situation. You know, they told us we weren't gonna get our money. I figured if we could at least get our money, we had already been talking to World Class Wrestling, and we were already gonna take off for there, so I figured we could use the money for new costumes, for you know, the moving expenses and things like that. And he said, Jim immediately was like, you stabbed me in the back, man. You did this without me. You're trying to stab me in the back. And Steve said, no, he just wouldn't listen. And then eventually I got a dial tone, and that was it. That was the end of the Bladerunners. Now in various different places, you'll find different variances of this story and what different people believe happened. Some cases you'll see where the Warrior felt like he was just a guy who had an ambition, and Steve Borden wouldn't go along with it. It was almost like he felt like Steve wanted to listen to too many people, whereas Jim had his own ideas of how to be great. And Steve said he didn't think it was that. He said it was more of, they wanted, you know, these organizations wanted you to learn the business. They wanted you to learn it their way, and Jim had a different way, and he didn't want to learn it their way. And he said, so I was just, in more people's eyes, I was easier to deal with, and I was willing to learn, whereas Jim wasn't. And that to me is like kind of the weirdest thing to think of, is that 2 guys that immensely talented, and at the time they were pretty much all they had for each other, they were great friends, they would end up severing their relationship and then be bigger separate than together. as you would know, the Ultimate Warrior would go on to, in World Class, become the Dingo Warrior, and then eventually WWF would take him on and he would become the Ultimate Warrior. Arguably at the time, the biggest, most popular wrestler on the entire roster of WWF. And then Sting would eventually be part of WCW, and he would be, other than Ric Flair, the top earner there and the biggest draw there, and would eventually become synonymous with the WCW logo. But to me, it's just so crazy to think of. They first met here in what's now an auto parts store in 1985, and a year later, because of an ad posted here, Steve Borden would get into wrestling, eventually, you know, as we would know, become Sting. So it was a really wise move on his half, and would invite Jim to come be a part of it. So they really both got their start from this location here. Sting says even to this day, because of those days on the road and how poor they were, and that they literally, because they were bodybuilders and they really needed protein, they literally just lived off of orange juice and canned tuna. He said to this day, when he opens a can of tuna, he immediately thinks of those days and almost can't eat it. And I honestly don't know if this place is permanently closed or if it's closed because of the pandemic, or if it's just closed. It's a weekday right now and it's 9 a.m. so I kind of thought they'd be open and that maybe we could walk through the old Gold's Gym. You know what? We are in luck. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed through the glass on the other side in the back entrance someone is unlocking, so maybe they'll let us walk through and show the interiors a little. All right, we're over here at the back entrance. We'll see what they say. I think they'll probably be cool about it. So here we are. They were kind enough to let me show a little bit of the inside. Originally, when I said, you know, I'm doing a video about the history of the Gold's Gym, and they said, no, this is not it. It was down the street. And I said, no, this was the original location. And he said, no, it's not. He said, we've been here 35 years. And then I showed him the picture of the group from 1986 out front. And he goes, wow, I had no idea. So this is it. I'll actually show you after this the photo that I found of the group out front of this, right in front of this glass. It was the original look and everything, but yeah, hard to believe that this is where Jim Hellwig and Steve Borden would originally meet. They would work out here, and apparently a lot of famous bodybuilders worked out here and wrestlers throughout time. This is where they would meet and eventually become the Bladerunners. Warrior, you have returned. And it's pretty crazy that as long as this guy's been here, he had no clue what was here right before it. But when I show you the photo out front, behind all the backs of the members, you'll be able to see the Gold's Gym writing on the glass. So there you can see his exact address. So you take a look at this storefront and the photo that I'm going to impose over it, and you tell me what you think. Yep, you can see where it would have said Gold's Gym across that glass. Well, I've been wanting to vlog this for a very, very long time, and I finally got to do it. One of the things that I really love about vlogging is not only telling the story, but I never know what's going to be here when I show up. So kind of weird to do a whole vlog about two wrestlers basically in front of an auto parts store. But absolutely worth our time. Now, the one thing I couldn't figure out that I would have loved to have included in this vlog, I guess someday if we ever run into Sting, Steve Borden, we'll have to ask him, is when he sold out his co-ownership of this, and you know, what all happened with that, because I couldn't figure that out. I actually didn't even know that it moved. So those guys in there were surprised to find out some history, and I was surprised to find out that shortly after he owned this, that they moved. Well, gentlemen, I think for this vlog, it's probably pretty much over. All right, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this vlog. I've wanted to make it for quite a while, and for you wrestling fans, I'm hoping you were as excited about seeing that as I was to do it, because I've always wondered where those two met, where that gym was that Sting always supposedly owned. So cool for me to get to see that. Thank you all for watching. Thank you Don and Tom O'Connor, Jennifer Peebles, Lauren Miller, Quincy, Pamela Singleton, and Alicia Cruz for becoming my newest Patreons. We'll see you all next time, and don't worry, we are not done with the Ultimate Warrior vlogs. Always believe.